Welcome to You and the Law. You and the Law is sponsored by the Chicago Bar Association, and we are here today to talk about mental health law. Specifically, should the insanity defense be abolished? My name is Eleanor O, and I am your moderator for today's show. I'm an attorney and a member of the Chicago Bar Association, and let me first introduce our attorney guest speakers. Farthest from me is Mark Heyrmann. He is a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago. And closest to me is sole practitioner Randy Kretchmar, who is based in Wilmette, Illinois. Okay, the question today is, should the insanity defense be abolished? So let's first start with, what is insanity as defined by the Illinois statutes? A person is not criminally responsible for conduct if at the time of such conduct, as a result of mental disease or mental defect, he lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct. But keep in mind, the terms mental disease or mental defect do not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. So, Professor Heyrmann, let's start with you. What is your view on whether the insanity defense should be abolished?
Well, I think the insanity defense serves a useful purpose, and so I think it should not be abolished. Illinois has the insanity defense. 45 of the 50 states have an insanity defense, and I think we should keep it. It's a small part of the criminal justice system. People think that it's used all the time. It's rarely used. Last year in Illinois, there were 61 people acquitted by reason of insanity. That's out of thousands and thousands of felony prosecutions. So if you think about we usually think about there being 4 reasons why we send people to prison. We punish them. We punish them because we want to deter other people for retribution purposes, because we think justice requires it. We put them in prison to incapacitate them. We put them in prison to rehabilitate them or treat them. None of those 4 purposes are served very well by putting people with serious mental illnesses in prison. They're served better, not perfectly, by putting people with serious mental illnesses in mental hospitals or at some point back in the community.
Okay,
again,
so
for the small, again, not everyone with mental illnesses, but for the small number of people who meet the strict criteria that you just read to us.
Okay, so if the insanity defense is used to find a not guilty verdict by reason of insanity, and then that defendant would not be incarcerated but be put into a mental institution because of those mental defects. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now turning to you, Randy, my understanding is that you believe the insanity defense should be abolished, so talk briefly about that and your reasons why.
I think the insanity defense confuses us. I think it demeans both our law and our scientific medicine. Criminality is more or less considered to be harmful action against knowledge of right and wrong, and insanity is generally considered to be inability to distinguish right from wrong. So you have to look at whether you consider people in general, human beings, to be social or entirely selfish and self-centered. And if it's the former, which we tend to generally figure people are essentially social to some degree, then any criminality is also insanity.
Okay, now you bring up a couple of points that I want to touch on.
Yeah.
You started out by saying that the insanity offense is demeaning. What do you mean by that? A little more detail on that, please.
Well, I think we decided that there are a number of people who do horrible things, but we don't want to just punish them. We think we can do better. We want to fix them, which is a good, humane impulse to begin with. Problem comes when we don't know how to fix somebody. We don't know how to make them behave better by treating them. The phrase in the law in Illinois, in fact, that excludes, let's see if I get it exactly, only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. That's excluded from insanity. if that's the only evidence, in other words, somebody behaves badly, then you can't say this is a mental illness. Well, there isn't any other evidence of mental illness, ultimately.
Okay.
The person behaves badly.
Okay.
Whether it's by being too depressed and staying in his bed all day, or whether it's by walking around talking to the air in the street and smelling bad, it's still bad behavior. There isn't any other, in theory, if you exclude repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct, you don't have anything else to determine that somebody's mentally ill.
Okay, so Professor Heyrmann, let me ask you, do you feel that the insanity defense is in some way demeaning?
No, I don't think so. For one thing, the defendant himself, in consultation with his or her attorney, must agree to the insanity defense. You have to be fit to stand trial to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and you have to choose this. It's often unwise for people to choose the insanity defense. So it's a choice. They say this is, and it's usually chosen by criminal defendants and their lawyers when they have no other defense.
And when you say it's unwise, what do you mean by that? How is it unwise to choose
Well,
this
so
defense?
one of the things that is true in Illinois and is true in most states that have the insanity defense is that if you're charged with a less serious crime, you may end up spending longer time in a mental hospital than you would have spent in the prison had you been convicted. And Illinois law, unfortunately, permits that. And often people stay because we're confused about whether they've gotten better. We have tremendously effective treatments. Almost everyone, in fact, really everyone who's acquitted by reason of insanity gets treatment in the state psychiatric hospital and gets out and lives in the community. And in fact, the recidivism rate, the repeat rate of criminal behavior or even the need to be hospitalized among people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity is very, very low because they get effective treatment in the hospital and they often get treatment in the community and they never reoffend. And the problem with putting people in prison is, unfortunately, even though there's a constitutional right to treatment in prison, the treatment in prisons is pretty bad. Our state prison system is, like many states, in the middle of a huge lawsuit over the adequacy of care. The Supreme Court of the United States just weighed in on California, and they said they ordered them to release 10,000 people because of inadequate mental health services in their prison.
Okay, let's talk about treatment for a second then. So, Randy, Professor Heyrmann has brought up that the treatment that people who are acquitted by reason of insanity is superior to any kind of treatment they would get in prison if they were incarcerated. What is your view on the treatment that such people receive?
I think the treatment has an appearance of being very effective in the short term. Professor Heyrmann notes that we're confused about whether or not people are no longer dangerous. That's why we don't let them out as early as we might if they had served a prison sentence. And by the way, on somebody having to agree to an insanity defense, a lot of times for practical purposes, they don't. They're told by a public defender. And in fact, I may be wrong, but I think a public defender can plead somebody not guilty by reason of insanity, whether they agree or not. I certainly have known patients at state psychiatric facilities who claim that they never intended to plead NGRI. But this confusion about whether or not somebody is adequately treated is an interesting point. Why would we be so confused? After so many years of so much research and apparently at least claims of such effective treatment, why don't we even know?
Okay, let me ask you this. So if, as you believe, the insanity defense should be abolished, then there would be no such treatment. There would be no such mental institutions for people to receive such treatment. Do you have an alternative in mind, some sort of alternative you could propose if the insanity defense were ever abolished?
I don't know why we would have no mental institutions. to the extent that treatment is effective and the benefits clearly outweigh the harms, then people want it. There's a market for it. I simply don't think we have to enforce it on anybody.
Okay, and so Professor Heyrmann, let's talk about that. Why should the insanity defense be enforced? Why is that so important?
Well, one needs to separate the defense and then the consequences. So, as I suggested, if I don't know right from wrong, then it's unlikely that the prospect of being punished is going to deter me from committing the crime. And so if that's one of the goals of the criminal justice system, which I think we all agree to, then it may seem unfair to punish me. And similarly, it seems unjust. We say the punishment fits the crime, but I don't know why I did it. So then the question is, what do you do after you've been acquitted? And if as the Supreme Court said about this, if you've been found due to mental illness to have committed a serious crime, there should be at least an assumption that maybe that mental illness is still continuing, and we should at least evaluate you as to treatment. That's what we do in Illinois. We send you off, and you're evaluated, and if a court finds that you need to be treated, you will be treated. And so if the mental illness has been the principal cause of the crime, then we want to treat the mental illness to make us safe, a selfish reason. It seems like a perfectly legitimate selfish reason that we would want to make us safe and not let someone go until they've been successfully treated. I happen to think we keep people too long, but that's mostly because there's a great deal of ambivalence about the insanity defense, and I think there's some sense that we should punish people a little. And so there are many aspects about what we actually do with people who are acquitted by reason of insanity that smack of a bit of punishment. And I think the length of confinement is one of those things.
Okay, so let's talk about confinement and treatment a little bit. And so, Randy, is it your position that when people are committed, that they are committed for too long, they stay in these institutions for too long?
I think it depends on the person. I think if somebody commits a violent crime, they have an obligation and we have a right to ask for some demonstration that they're not going to hurt anybody again.
Okay, and what kind of demonstration would that be?
Well, they have to be able to behave themselves under some perhaps gradiently increased challenge. I think in some sense the state system as we have it could work. The problem is that it's presumed to be an entirely medical endeavor, and the truth is, it's, as Professor Heyrmann notes, we're very confused about whether or not somebody's been successfully treated. Perhaps I would argue that's because we don't recognize that what we're looking at is behavior, period. And if you tell somebody you have to demonstrate behavior according to these criteria, that seems eminently reasonable to me.
So is it your position that if there were no insanity defense, people should still receive mental health treatment if necessary, but at some point they can be rehabilitated to the point where they can go back into society and become a contributing member of society?
Ideally, they don't end up on the dole for life.
Okay.
Certainly.
And so let's talk a specific hypothetical. If someone is charged with murder and they are found not guilty by reason of insanity, what kind of test or what kind of measure are we going to look for in order for them to be put back into society?
Well, I have plenty of clients who are not guilty by reason of insanity on murder. And they come to me because they have some, they have a problem with the treatment that they believe they're being forced to accept in order to ever have a life. Now, you have to start from the point of view, well, if they killed somebody, maybe they're not much entitled to a life, but...
That probably is the general thinking.
Yeah, sure. But on the other hand, we did decide that we don't want to punish them, that we want to help them instead. Mm-hmm. So we're in this quandary. And what my guys do, my clients come to me and say, I don't want to take this drug, or I don't want to have to be treated in this way by the staff. And I tell them, well, you know, I can probably, as an attorney, prevent you from being forced to accept some drug, but I can't get you out of here unless you convince these people who are your treatment team, plus your judge, plus the administration of this institution, et cetera, that you're not dangerous anymore. Now, how are you going to do that? And some of them do, and it has nothing to do with treating any illness.
Okay.
It has to do with them learning how to behave themselves and be social.
Okay, so Professor Heyrmann, if we were to talk about institutions, what is your take on this learning to be able to be social?
So that's the part where we completely disagree. That is what most of the folks who are confined in state psychiatric hospitals, about having been found not guilty by reason of insanity. There's about 350 of them in Illinois. Most of them are demonstrating appropriate behavior in the psychiatric hospital. And what the psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers are looking for beyond that behavior, because most of them are not injuring anyone, threatening anyone, they are behaving appropriately. But psychiatrists are looking for symptoms that are not behavior. They're looking for hallucinations and delusions and other symptoms of mental illness that, which certainly must have predated the crime. So it's almost impossible to be acquitted by reason of insanity if you claim, oh, I just became mentally ill yesterday, the day I committed my crime. I'm not saying that never happens, but it's pretty rare. Most people who are successful in having an insanity defense and are acquitted are people who have a long history, usually of untreated mental illness, unfortunately, which is demonstrated by things completely unrelated to the crime. It's not like they've been killing people or they would have been arrested before. They have been unable to organize their lives due to the interference of hallucinations and delusions and perhaps serious depression, et cetera, and then something horrible happens, they commit this horrible crime, and then a judge or a jury says you're acquitted by reason of insanity, and then maybe they finally get treatment. And the treatment is designed to treat the underlying illness, not the behavior, because the behavior usually goes away immediately. Mental hospitals are very safe places to be by and large. I'm at psychiatric hospitals all the time, and I've never been fearful that anyone was going to injure me. But that's not and should not be the test of whether you get out. The test of whether you get out is whether your mental illness has been successfully treated so that you are unlikely, if you get into the community, to hurt somebody or hurt yourself.
Okay, so go ahead.
Professor Heyrmann and I agree, I think, more than he realizes. When I say behavior, I'm not speaking of violent behavior, I'm speaking of behavior generally. And hallucinations and delusions and depression as the kind of things that clinicians are looking for and are attempting to treat are only evidenced by what the patient says and does. And if you read through a psychiatric chart, which consists, if somebody's been there for a couple of years, it consists of thousands of pages most of the time.
Okay.
There's never anything in that chart. There's never any note that indicates anything except what somebody has said or done, or an interpretation of what somebody has said or done. It's all behavior. They don't have any test for delusions or hallucinations. It's not a medical technology in the same way that oncology or some other specialty might be. It's all observation and interpretation of behavior. And when I say a guy has to learn to behave himself and convince his treatment team and the administration and the court system that he's okay and that he can be trusted, I'm not talking about he has to spend a couple years without beating anybody up. I'm saying that he has to behave in such a way that people say, you know what, he seems normal to me.
Okay, then if we are going to, you say that there are no such tests, but there must be some sort of guideline, something that clinicians are looking for that constitutes normal behavior.
Yeah, there are
Okay,
certainly.
and what would that be?
Well, if a guy follows all the rules, if he shows up at morning meeting and he speaks in an appropriate way, doesn't go on and on and on about irrelevant matters, doesn't interrupt people, doesn't storm out, doesn't get in too many arguments. It's essentially interpersonal communication and behavior, and there are many checklists, but it doesn't consist of anything more than interpretation and observation of behavior.
Okay, and so Professor Heyrmann, if we're talking about tests and guidelines as to whether the mental illness has been treated, what would you consider successful mental health treatment?
Well, I think that's too general a question to answer. So there are lots of different illnesses that will cause someone to be in a psychiatric hospital. The successful treatment will vary depending upon what those are. So I guess where Mr. Kretchmar and I disagree is that it isn't that the patient is learning how to behave, it's that the patient no longer has the belief system that is delusional. So if I have a client who believes he's the king of Egypt and that he shouldn't be in the psychiatric hospital because the United States has no jurisdiction over him. Okay?
Okay.
If it's true that he's the king of Egypt, he's right that the United States has no, but there's no evidence of that. His behavior at the hospital is immaculate in the sense of he gets along perfectly, but it's hard to pretend not to be mentally ill if you have a serious mental illness. That is, it's particularly hard to pretend not to be mentally ill in a mental hospital where you're observed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's 3 shifts. There's never not mental health professionals there. So so the question is, when is that delusional belief going to go away? And if it goes away, it may or may not change his day-to-day behavior, but that belief will no longer be there, that delusional belief. If I have hallucinations and I see things, I may or may not report them every day. But a competent psychiatrist is not going to say, oh, he's just not talking about them. And that's why, particularly with someone who's committed a serious crime, you're looking for an ongoing period in which it can be demonstrated that the hallucinations have in fact gone away, not just the patient has learned something. Patients may think they can pretend to fool their psychiatrist. It's not so easy.
Okay, okay. So if the insanity defense were to be abolished, Randy, and then you were talking earlier about it's incorrect or demeaning to force mental health treatment on others, but if that were taken away and someone is found guilty and has mental illness, how would that treatment take place then? How would it be able to occur?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Ultimately, it's a matter of how do we deal with people who behave badly, right? Mm-hmm. Down through the ages, we've had a lot of different human systems of dealing with people who behave badly. We will continue to have many of them. I simply don't think that a medicalized treatment, quote unquote, applies to criminality. I think it would be easy to say all criminality is in fact insanity, and therefore we should keep anyone who breaks the law and treat them until we're absolutely certain that they won't break the law again.
But I believe Professor Heyrmann quoted numbers where the insanity defense is not often successful. It's very rarely used.
9,000 people with serious mental illnesses in our state prison system. Overwhelmingly, people with serious mental illnesses do not get acquitted by reason of insanity. I am not making an argument that those 9,000 people should be transferred to the mental hospital and found not guilty by reason of insanity. We single out a small number of people for whom retribution and deterrence don't work. If you abolish the insanity defense, it would have a relatively small effect on the criminal justice system. You'd move the 350 people, or presumably you wouldn't move them because they've already been acquitted, but there wouldn't be those 350 people in a state mental hospital. They'd be in a state prison where they would get pathetically bad mental health services, and at the end of their prison term they would still be seriously mentally ill. And so if in fact, which is what the insanity defense is about, the mental illness caused them to commit a serious crime, we are going to see a high likelihood that when they leave the state prison system, they will still be dangerous because we've done nothing for them. And to the extent we do provide psychiatric treatment in state prisons, and we do, not very good treatment, we are much more apt to coerce treatment in state prison systems. Mr. Kretchmar is exactly right. He represents people often, and if they don't want to be medicated, he is very good at helping them, and that, in my view, is a good thing.
Okay.
But in prison, they don't have the right to a hearing and to have Mr. Kretchmar's services as a lawyer to prevent themselves from being medicated.
Okay, so Randy, so Professor Heyrmann just said that if the insanity defense were to be abolished, a very small number of people, a small percentage of the population would be affected. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's 350 people.
Okay, and then so if it should be abolished and it's going to affect such a small number of people, what are your thoughts on why Illinois, keeps it going if it's, as you said, demeaning to people?
I think because people want to believe that we have this class of experts who can explain and cure what appears to be utterly insane antisocial behavior, and it makes people. It's a cover-up for what we don't know. That's why I think it's demeaning. I think we need to. I think we need to talk to people and understand even the worst of the worst better than we do, and I don't think we can turn them over to a medical specialist who will cure their belief that they're the king of Egypt, for example.
Okay.
I mean, you can't. I can't imagine treating somebody medically to change their beliefs.
Okay.
In theory, I suppose, if there were some way to look inside the brain and see beliefs that are delusional and fix only those delusional beliefs, then we'd have a medical enterprise. But you can't do that. And whether or not somebody's belief is delusional is almost always a subjective opinion.
And
I completely disagree with that.
Okay.
That is, so how is what would you do to treat someone who has delusional beliefs or hallucinations? Most typically you will give them medication. If I believe in something that is part of my society, so I grew up from the outside, people may say, oh, your beliefs are crazy. But if it's part of my culture, sometimes a religion or whatever, psychotropic medication will have no effect on that because it's not a delusional belief, it's a cultural belief. Psychotropic medication only works on delusional beliefs when it works. It doesn't work on all of them, unfortunately. But if your belief changes because of the medication, you can be sure it was a delusional belief. Your belief in a political system, a philosophy, a religion will not be changed by medication or the kinds of treatment that are available in psychiatric hospitals. Those beliefs continue.
okay, well, it seems like the medication of treating mental health illness could go on. That would be a whole other show. And so, unfortunately, we've run out of time today on this topic. I want to thank my guests, Professor Mark Heyrmann and Randy Kretchmar, sole practitioner. Thank you so much for watching, and on behalf of the Chicago Bar Association, have a great night.